So imagine waking up tomorrow, grabbing your phone and seeing a massive news alert, like breaking news everywhere.
Right.
The CEO of, say, the world's most profitable tech conglomerate has just been legally evicted from their position.
Evicted? Wow.
Yeah, evicted.
Yeah.
And you read the press release, and it doesn't mention embezzlement or a plunging stock price or even like a boardroom coup. The legal justification for their removal is literally, verbatim, a quantifiable depletion of empathy.
That is, I mean, that's wild.
Right. They stopped caring for people, so their lease on power was just terminated. It sounds like a sci-fi movie.
Yeah, or just a completely alien way of structuring human society.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But today, we are actually taking a magnifying glass to a framework that proposes exactly that kind of reality. So welcome to the deep dive.
I'm really excited for this one.
Me too. Today, we're doing something a bit different. We are looking at a document called The Blueprint of a Peaceful World. But we aren't, like, skimming the whole thing.
You know, that would take hours.
Right. Instead, we are isolating a single hyper-dense paragraph, just one paragraph, known as point 10.
And honestly, the concentration of paradigm-shifting ideas in just that single paragraph is profound. It's titled Culture of Service with this little subtitle, Distributed Leadership.
Which is a heavy title already.
It really is.
Yeah.
And rather than scanning a whole manifesto, isolating this one paragraph just allows us to see how a completely different societal operating system might actually function.
Yeah, so let me actually just read the core elements of point 10 for you guys so we have the foundation.
Go for it.
Okay, so it argues that the highest self-realization of a person is in service, and it specifically uses the term seva, S-E-V-A. It then defines servant leadership by stating that power is not a privilege, but a lease of public trust justified by caring for people.
That lease part is so key.
Yeah, it's huge. And then it claims true greatness is measured by the ability to serve, not subjugate. And finally, it concludes by demanding an atmosphere of psychological safety where mistakes are fuel for learning, not a reason for punishment.
There is so much to unpack there.
Oh, totally. We are going to put all of those concepts into a wind tunnel today. And just as a quick reminder to you listening, we aren't here to, like, endorse this as a political ideology.
Right, absolutely not.
We're just here to ruthlessly analyze the mechanics of how this blueprint would actually operate if, human beings tried to build it in the real world.
Which is the fun part.
Exactly. And to do that, we have to start at the absolute foundation of human drive. Because this text, it basically attempts to rewire our core motivations.
It really does.
Okay, let's unpack this. It claims the highest self-realization of a person is in service, placing that word seva right there in parentheses.
Yeah, and using that specific Sanskrit term, seva, is really the linchpin of the whole argument. I mean, we all know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
Oh, sure, the pyramid.
Exactly, the pyramid. And we generally accept that the pinnacle of human existence, that self-actualization phase at the top is, well, it's individualistic.
Right, it's about me reaching my potential.
Yes. It's the solitary genius in the lab, or the athlete peaking in their performance. It's the individual reaching their own maximum potential. But seva fundamentally rejects that solitary summit.
Wait, usually self-realization is painted as, like, climbing a solo mountain and planting your own flag at the summit.
Exactly.
But this text suggests the peak isn't about you at all, which is, in its deepest cultural context, seva is action completely stripped of ego, right?
Yes, completely. It is service performed without the slightest expectation of return or validation or even elevated status for the person who is doing the serving.
Which, okay, that introduces massive friction with our modern Western operating system.
Oh, a ton of friction.
Because our entire economic and social infrastructure is built on the premise that you were incentivized to work hard because you get a reward.
Right. You get the money, the status.
You get the corner office, you get the big bonus, you get your name on the side of the building. If we remove the reward, if action is totally stripped of ego, what happens to ambition?
That's the big question.
Right. Like, does this mean ambition is a bad thing in this framework? Because the drive to conquer markets, to build skyscrapers, to cure diseases that ambition literally built the modern world is this framework just assuming ambition evaporates?
Well, no, that is the pivotal systemic question here. The text doesn't suggest destroying the engine of ambition at all. It's actually attempting to change the fuel and the destination.
Okay, change the fuel. How so?
So the sheer kinetic energy required to be brilliant or to innovate or to work those crazy 90-hour weeks, that energy is retained. But consider the neurobiology of status for a second.
Okay, I'm with you.
Human beings are inherently social creatures. We release dopamine and serotonin when our peers validate us, right? We want to be seen as valuable to the tribe.
Yeah, we literally crave status on a biological level.
Exactly. Now, in a society that equates self-realization with wealth accumulation or personal power, our ambition naturally flows toward hoarding resources because that's what gets you the dopamine hit from society.
Right. You buy a super yacht and everyone thinks you're successful.
Yes. But if a society culturally recalibrates its definition of the ultimate apex to seva, to selfless service, human ambition would theoretically calibrate to that new North Star.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you're saying the most hyper-competitive Type A personalities wouldn't be competing to build the biggest personal fortune anymore.
Right. They'd be channeling that exact same aggressive drive into something else.
So they'd be competing to, like, design the most efficient, clean water grid for a developing nation.
Yes, or to eradicate a localized disease the fastest. And they wouldn't do it for the patent or to get rich.
They would do it because, in this specific blueprint, extreme effective altruism is the only recognized currency of high status.
Exactly. Consider the societal implications of that. Like, imagine if the billionaire space race wasn't about who could plant a personal flag on Mars, right?
Right. Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk just trying to outdo each other.
Right. But imagine if instead that exact same competitive rivalry was focused on who could permanently solve supply chain food waste.
That is a crazy thought experiment.
It is, because it requires just as much engineering genius, just as much capital mobilization, and just as much competitive drive. But the text argues that hoarding that drive just to elevate yourself is actually a stunted, biologically immature form of self-realization.
Immature, that's a strong word.
Well, true self-realization, according to this framework, recognizes that the self is a porous concept. It's inextricably linked to the entire network of humanity.
But okay, if society's ultimate status symbol is selfless service, that completely destabilizes our traditional definition of authority.
How so?
Well, you can't have a CEO or a politician sitting on a throne demanding tribute if the only way to actually gain status is to give your energy away.
Yeah.
That tension forces an entirely different organizational architecture, which leads us directly into the source's next concept, where it states, we practice servant leadership.
Right, and that phrasing, servant leadership, it pushes us past philosophical goals and right into the hard structural mechanics of how things run.
Because it sounds almost like an oxymoron at first.
It really does, because the traditional hierarchy is a rigid pyramid. We all know it.
Yeah.
The apex leader sits at the top, and the massive base of employees or citizens or soldiers, they exist purely to support that peak.
Yeah, the many serve the one.
Exactly. Information and resources flow upward to the leader, and commands flow downward from the leader.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Because if we visualize flipping that pyramid upside down, structurally, it sounds like a nightmare.
It does sound precarious.
Right. Like, the apex is now at the bottom.
Yeah.
And they're bearing the crushing weight of the entire organization. Doesn't servant imply weakness? If everyone is serving, who is actually making the tough calls or steering the ship?
Well, serving doesn't mean being a doormat. But you're right, an inverted pyramid absolutely would collapse if it relied on a single point of failure, which is exactly why the blueprint nests servant leadership under the broader heading of distributed leadership.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
Distributed.
Yeah. We have to discard the pyramid metaphor entirely. This isn't about one martyr at the bottom holding everyone up. We need to look at decentralized networks.
Like, what's a good example?
Think about edge computing and technology, or like a mycelial network in a forest.
The mushroom networks underground.
Exactly. There isn't a central command server processing every single decision for the entire forest.
Right, the processing power is pushed to the edges, to where the interaction is actually happening in real time.
Yes. In a distributed servant leadership model, authority is highly fluid. It's not a static title you hold on to forever. It shifts dynamically to wherever the situational awareness or the required expertise is highest at any given moment.
Wait, so the leader changes based on what the problem is?
Exactly. A servant leader isn't weak, and they aren't subservient to every passing whim of the group. They are subservient to the mission.
Okay, let's put this in a real-world scenario so I can wrap my head around it.
Yeah.
Practically, let's say a massive cybersecurity breach hits a major bank.
Good example.
In a normal company, the CEO calls a war room and tries to dictate the response. But here, the authority instantly routes to, say, the lead systems engineer.
Yes.
That engineer temporarily becomes the apex leader, and the CEO's job immediately transforms into serving that engineer.
Exactly.
So the CEO is fetching coffee, clearing roadblocks, securing emergency budgets, running interference with the press. The CEO is serving the person who is best equipped to serve the immediate crisis.
That perfectly illustrates the mechanism. And the moment the crisis is resolved, the authority routes back or it shifts to the next critical node. Maybe the PR person becomes the leader for the fallout phase.
Wow. That eliminates the massive bottleneck of the traditional hierarchy.
Exactly, the bottleneck where everything must wait for the boss's approval. The organization becomes highly adaptable because leadership is treated as a temporary utility rather than a permanent identity.
Which introduces a concept so radical it essentially requires rewriting contract law as we know it.
It really does.
Because if leadership is temporary and authority routes to whoever can best serve the mission, then you don't actually own your power. You can't hoard it. And the blueprint codifies this explicitly. It says, power is not a privilege, but a lease of public trust, justified by caring for people.
What's fascinating here is the introduction of the legal and financial concept of a lease. It's an absolute structural masterpiece in this text.
A masterpiece. Why?
Look at the historical evolution of power. For millennia, it was a divine right, unaccountable and absolute. The king speaks, God speaks.
Right.
Then it evolved into a privilege of birth the aristocracy. And even in our modern democracies or corporate structures, power is still largely treated as property. You win the election, you get the promotion, the power is yours to wield, it's your property.
And when you believe you own a piece of property, you feel inherently entitled to do whatever you want with it.
Exactly.
Think of renting an apartment versus owning a house. If you own the house, you can knock down a wall, you can let the pipes rust. It's yours, who cares?
Yes, but a lease legally establishes that you are not the owner.
Right.
The very first premise of a lease is that you are merely borrowing the asset. The landlord, which point 10 explicitly defines as the public, the collective, retains ultimate ownership of the power.
I love this analogy. Let's expand on this architecture of a lease. A lease has an expiration date, obviously. It has restrictive covenants, like things you are explicitly forbidden from doing.
Yeah.
No smoking, no pets.
Right, no subjugating people.
Exactly. But the most vital component of a lease is the rent. You have to pay the owner for the right to occupy the space. And this framework defines the currency of that rent as caring for people.
And that definition, if you really think about it, completely inverts the psychology of the power holder.
How so? Like in their daily life?
Yeah. If you operate under the traditional privilege model, your morning internal monologue is all about fortification. You wake up and think, how do I consolidate my position today? How do I leverage this asset for maximum personal gain?
How do I defend my turf from the guy in the next cubicle?
Exactly. But if you internalize the lease model, you wake up knowing the rent is due. You have a legally binding obligation to justify your occupancy of that leadership role through tangible acts of care every single day.
Let's test that against reality, though, because it sounds nice, but let's look at a modern CEO.
Okay, let's do it.
If a CEO generates a record-breaking quarter for shareholders by, say, slashing benefits, firing thousands of people, and just destroying the mental health of the remaining workforce, the current privilege model rewards them.
Oh, absolutely. They get a massive bonus.
Right, because they maximize the asset. They made the stock go up.
But under the lease model, they have fundamentally breached the contract.
Even if they made a ton of money.
Yes.
Yeah.
They generated capital, sure, but they defaulted on the rent because the rent is paid in care, not in quarterly profits.
Oh, man. They basically stripped the copper wiring out of the walls of the apartment to sell for scrap.
That is a perfect way to put it.
Like, sure, they produced a short-term cash flow, but they vandalized the property they were entrusted to maintain. They hurt the people.
The copper wire analogy gets right to the heart of extractive leadership versus custodial leadership. Extracting value at the expense of human well-being is literal vandalism of the public trust in this framework.
It's a total paradigm shift.
But, and this is a big but, to operationalize this, a society would need rigorous, enforceable mechanisms. You can't just rely on an honor system where we hope the tenant is a benevolent person.
Right, because human ego is incredibly sticky. The longer someone occupies the penthouse, the more they convince themselves they actually built the building.
Exactly.
So how do you measure caring for people? You can't easily put empathy on a spreadsheet. If the rent is due, how does the landlord, the public, actually collect it?
Well, it requires radical transparency and high-frequency feedback loops that we just currently lack the infrastructure for.
Like constant voting.
Sort of. You would need mechanisms for rapid recall that don't wait for a 4-year election cycle or an annual shareholder meeting. Imagine a system where if the metrics of employee or citizen well-being drop below a certain threshold, the lease is automatically put into review.
A smart contract for human well-being.
Exactly. It forces a complete redesign of what we consider successful leadership.
And if the definition of success shifts that dramatically, we have to rethink the very concept of historical greatness itself,
We really do.
which is where the blueprint takes its next massive swing. It asserts true greatness is measured by the ability to serve, not subjugate.
We really have to unpack the friction between those two actions, serving and subjugating. Historically, the human race has overwhelmingly equated the capacity to subjugate with greatness.
Yeah, to force others to submit.
Right. Subjugation is the act of bringing someone under domination or control through force, fear, or leverage.
So what does this all mean for our history books? Look at everyone titled The Great in history. Alexander the Great, Catherine the Great, Peter the Great.
All of them.
They earned those titles through conquest. They expanded borders, crushed rebellions, and forced millions to bow to their will. Our entire civilizational narrative is that dominance equals strength.
But this text challenges that narrative at a biological and psychological level. It posits that the drive to subjugate is actually a manifestation of profound internal weakness.
That feels counterintuitive, though. I mean, if an emperor can command an army to level an entire city, how is that weakness?
Because reliance on external force implies an internal deficit. Think about it. To subjugate another human being, you are engaging in the ultimate zero-sum game. You require them to be small so that you can feel large.
Wow. Yeah.
You must constantly apply the levers of fear, deprivation, and violence just to maintain your position. The moment you remove the force, what happens?
The subjugated population rebels instantly.
Exactly. It is an incredibly fragile, insecure state of existence.
It's an empire built on tension. You can never sleep because the people you're stepping on are constantly trying to stand up. You're exhausted.
Now compare that to the immense psychological security required to serve someone else.
That takes a lot of confidence.
It takes an ego that is completely intact and unthreatened. To truly empower another person, to elevate them so they might even surpass your own capabilities, you have to be totally secure in your...
Because you aren't worried they're going to take your spot.
Right. Service builds resilient networks of mutual trust. Subjugation builds brittle hierarchies of compliance.
So if a society actually adopted this text, where greatness is measured by service and subjugation is viewed as like a primitive pathology, who gets the statues?
That's a great question.
Because we wouldn't be building bronze monuments of generals on horseback holding swords anymore. We'd have to rewrite our heroes.
The cultural markers of prestige would undergo a seismic shift. The monuments would be dedicated to the epidemiologists who eradicated polio.
Right.
The statues would honor the logistics experts who engineered supply chains that eliminated famine in a region. The people who designed systems of care that empowered the marginalized, they would occupy the cultural space currently reserved for conquerors and billionaires.
I love that image, but wait, I have a practical concern here.
Okay, shoot.
If leaders are stripping away fear entirely, refusing to subjugate, and actively empowering everyone below them, how do they prevent the entire system from just collapsing into chaos?
What do you mean by chaos?
Well, if you remove the fear of the boss's wrath, what stops a junior engineer from making a careless $1-million mistake? You can't just run an emergency room or a nuclear power plant or a global supply chain on good vibes.
No, you definitely can't.
There has to be a safety net that replaces the rigid control of fear. People need to know there are consequences, right?
And that tension brings us perfectly to the operational infrastructure of this entire framework. Point 10 states, we create an atmosphere of psychological safety where mistakes are fuel for learning, not a reason for punishment.
Okay, so psychological safety. That's a term that gets thrown around in corporate retreats a lot these days.
It's definitely a buzzword right now.
Yeah, and frankly, psychological safety sounds great on a bumper sticker, but how does it survive in high-stress, high-stakes environments? It often sounds like wrapping everyone's feelings in bubble wrap.
That is a very common and very dangerous misinterpretation of the research.
Really? How so?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Organizational behavioral scientists, like Amy Edmondson at Harvard, they define psychological safety as the shared belief that a team is safe for interpersonal risk-taking.
Okay, interpersonal risk-taking.
Right. It is not about lowering standards so nobody gets offended. It is actually the prerequisite for achieving the absolute highest standards possible.
I'm struggling with that. How does removing the fear of punishment raise the standard? If I know I won't be fired for totally messing up a spreadsheet, why would I be meticulous?
Because fear of punishment doesn't prevent mistakes. It prevents the reporting of mistakes.
Oh, wow.
In high-stakes environments, a hidden error is a systemic catastrophe just waiting to happen. If the culture is punitive, if the leader subjugates their team through the threat of firing or public humiliation, human nature dictates survival.
Right. Self-preservation kicks in. So if a nurse realizes they administered the wrong dosage of a medication, or a flight mechanic notices they forgot to torque a single bolt on an engine, and they know speaking up will ruin their career, they are strongly incentivized to stay quiet.
Yes, they stay quiet and they just pray.
They hope the patient doesn't crash, or the plane doesn't fall out of the sky. That is terrifying.
And that dynamic destroys the organization's connection to reality. The leader thinks everything is fine, but they're flying blind because the data they're receiving is being corrupted by fear.
So they can't even fix the problems because they don't know they exist.
Exactly. The Chernobyl disaster is a masterclass in the lethal consequences of a punitive culture.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
That system lacked psychological safety entirely. Operators noticed anomalies, they saw flaws in the reactor design, but admitting a problem to a superior in that rigid Soviet hierarchy was deemed more dangerous to their personal survival than a potential nuclear meltdown.
Which is just wild to think about. So psychological safety is actually a rigorous data collection tool.
Yes, exactly. It's an environment engineered to extract reality, no matter how uncomfortable or embarrassing that reality is.
It's the only way a culture of service can actually function.
Right, because you cannot serve a system if you are terrified to point out that the system is broken. Which leads us directly to the text's final alchemy, as I like to call it. Treating mistakes as fuel for learning, not a reason for punishment.
I really want to look at that metaphor. Fuel. Because it's such a specific word choice.
It is.
It's like designing an engine that runs on compost.
I love that analogy.
Think about it. The waste, the missteps, the human errors, they aren't treated as garbage to be hidden or just thrown away. They are literally the combustible material that powers the forward momentum of the entire organization.
Yes. They generate the energy to improve.
If you punish the person who made the mistake, you're essentially throwing away the fuel. You are starving the engine of the very data it needs to get better.
The compost engine is a phenomenal way to conceptualize it. In a subjugation model, punishing the mistake is the ultimate goal. The leader drops the hammer to remind everyone who holds the power. It's a display of dominance.
Look what happens if you cross me.
Exactly. But in this service model, punishing a well-intentioned error is viewed as a catastrophic failure of leadership.
Because it sends the wrong message to the team.
It teaches the entire network a chilling lesson. Never take a risk and never try to innovate. And if you accidentally break something, bury the evidence immediately.
But how do you practically design a system where people eagerly rush forward to report their own failures? Because, let's be real, nobody actually believes a company has psychological safety until they watch someone drop the ball and survive.
That's very true. You have to prove it. And it requires the institutionalization of what we call the blameless postmortem.
Blameless postmortem.
Yeah. The aviation industry is actually the gold standard for this. When an aviation incident occurs, or even a near miss, the investigation is rigorously, almost obsessively focused on the system, not the individual.
You separate the failure from the person's identity.
Completely. The inquiry isn't who is the idiot pilot that pressed the wrong button. The inquiry is what systemic conditions allowed a highly trained, well-intentioned professional to believe that pressing that button was the correct action at that moment.
Oh, that is such a subtle but massive shift in framing.
It changes everything. Was the dashboard design ambiguous? Was the protocol outdated? Was fatigue a factor we failed to mitigate with our scheduling system?
By doing that, the pilot doesn't feel attacked, so they're willing to give you all the details of exactly what went wrong.
And you get the fuel you need to fix the dashboard so no pilot ever makes that mistake again.
And this ties the entire paragraph back together into a closed, perfectly logical loop.
It really does. It's beautiful.
Let's trace it back. If power is a lease of public trust, justified by caring for people, then providing a psychologically safe environment where people can learn from their inevitable human errors without being destroyed by them is a fundamental act of care.
Yes.
It is exactly how the leader pays the rent.
It's a fractal architecture. The macro philosophy perfectly mirrors the micro operations.
Right.
You cannot achieve the highest self-realization of seva without leading through service. You cannot lead through service if you treat power as a permanent privilege rather than a temporary lease.
It all connects.
You cannot pay the rent on that lease if your goal is subjugation rather than greatness. And finally, you cannot empower people to greatness without an infrastructure of psychological safety that metabolizes those mistakes into wisdom. Every single sentence depends on the structural integrity of the others.
Wow. Just wow. Think about the friction this creates when you overlay this blueprint onto your actual daily life. For you listening right now, examine the environments you operate in today.
Yes, look around you.
Look to your workplace, your local government, your community boards, even your family dynamics. Analyze the power structures. Who is hoarding their position as a privilege, constantly building moats to defend their territory?
And conversely, who is treating their influence as a lease? Who is waking up every day trying to pay the rent through tangible acts of care?
And we really must apply that scrutiny inward too. Because it's easy to judge the boss, but what about us? When the people around you inevitably fail, when your subordinate misses a deadline, or your partner makes a financial error, or your peer just drops the ball, what is your default reflex?
That is the hardest question.
Are you reaching for the tools of subjugation and punishment? Or are you looking for the compost? Are you finding the fuel so the whole system can learn?
That is the daily grinding test of this framework. But if we scale this back up to the societal level, if power truly is just a lease paid for by caring for people, it leaves us with a staggering mechanical problem.
A mechanical problem.
Yeah, and it prompts a fascinating engineering challenge for you, the listener, to mull over long after this is over.
Ooh, I love a good thought experiment. Lay it on us.
If we accept the premise of point 10 entirely, how would you design a social, legal, or even technological mechanism that continuously measures a leader's care?
Because you can't just ask them, they'll lie.
Exactly. So how do you build a system that automatically evicts a leader the exact second their empathy runs dry? How do you cut off their access to power before subjugation even has a chance to begin?
The ultimate smart contract for human leadership, that is a brilliant final thought to chew on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into point 10. We took just a single paragraph and stretched it out into an entirely different worldview. Keep questioning the structural defaults around you, and we will catch you next time.